I chose 5 o'clock as the time because I am planning to have a beer while we do this. I also have to apologise for my presentation in itself, and that is because I'm about 8 weeks into a 4-week haircut. But unfortunately, in Auckland at level 4 and now level 3 lockdown, I can't change that. My daughters have offered many a time to solve it for me, but I don't have any great faith in their hairdressing skills. So the first of 4, I will share my PowerPoint presentation and we can just get into it. But I guess the thing that I'm really keen to do is make sure that this is of real value to everybody. So I'm quite keen for this to be as interactive as people want it to be. I could talk for the whole hour about service and service levels and the issues that arise. I will kind of try and work through this PowerPoint presentation relatively quickly to give us as much time as possible to talk about any specific issues, because I'm also very interested to hear and see what everybody is dealing with in the market at the moment. So I'm sure that you have all been working on these sorts of things a lot, and so I can share with you my insights, but I'm also really interested in getting other people's insights as well. So let's get into it, shall we? So I'll just make this a presentation. Here we go. So the first of 4, as we've talked about, this is services and service levels, intellectual property, data and liability yet to come. So when we're talking about services and service levels, a lot of people kind of start to talk about the fact that we need a service level agreement as if that is something different to the services agreement itself. The reality is that the service level agreement is a sub of the, or it's a part of the services agreement. It is the agreement that is reached in relation to the nature of the services and the level of performance in relation to those services. What we have to look at and what we should be talking about is the reality of any transaction where services are provided is that there are at least 2 parties to the agreement, and therefore there are at least 2 parties that have a role in relation to the agreement and the provision of those services. The service provider is going to have to do certain things, but it's important that it is clear to the customer as well what services are being provided and what their job is in relation to enabling those. So it's important to make sure that we set out clearly what and who are doing what. That can be a challenge if you haven't actually stopped to think about what it is that each party is going to do. Often you will find that service providers expect that they will provide a specific and limited number of services, and that is it, and everything else is carried by the customer, and vice versa. The customer is saying, look, I'll do certain specific things, and you, the service provider, are responsible for delivering everything else. So the issue that you need to kind of first address is what is each party going to do and who carries the risk for the silence. Part of that is about understanding, is this a full service where everything is provided? The customer is going to do a limited, finite list of things, or is it the other way around? Is it the customer is expected to do everything? They are the party that is in control of the environment, in control of the way in which things are delivered, and the service provider is there to provide specific aspects of the service that are integrated into the solution that the customer is expecting to have delivered. So that's the first thing. One of the things I think for those that attended the workshop that I ran a couple of years ago, one of the things that I should say at the beginning of this is that it's really, for me, the types of agreements that the types of agreements that we have and the types of relationships we're working on, it is all about the relationship. And so it's really important that the contract is looked at in a manner in which it's clear what the roles of the parties are, and that the contract itself tells a story, that it tells the story that you understand is the deal to be done and the roles of each of the parties. I think that once we've kind of worked out who's carrying the risk of the silence, the next thing is to work out how do we measure that the service is being provided, and what are we going to measure? It's really important, again, in relation to this, that it's clear what it is that we are expecting to be delivered. And if we are not clear about that, there is a real risk that the parties will have not met in the middle in terms of what it is that the expectations are about delivery and receipt. And again, we're back to a position where the parties end up arguing about whether they've got what they thought they're going to get. Often you will, with service contracts, have a set of standard documentation. Is it that you're measuring success against? Is it that the system, the solution, the services must meet? Or is it a RFP, a proposal? Is it something like that is expected? So again, we need to kind of look at what it is that we're providing, what it is that we are seeking to deliver, and what it is that the customer or the service provider has an expectation to be delivered and received. The next thing to think about is what happens if a party doesn't do something. Have we got that clear? And again, coming back to my conversation at the beginning of this, which is that both parties, or all of the parties in a service relationship, have a role. Is it clear what happens if that party doesn't do the role that they're supposed to do? Often you will see in a service agreement what happens in circumstances where the service provider doesn't do what they're supposed to do, but is it also clear what happens in circumstances where the customer or the recipient doesn't do what they're supposed to do? If they don't have the environment set up for you to deliver the solution, if they don't have the systems in place that you need to integrate with, if they don't have the physical assets available for you to use, what happens at that point? Do you get an opportunity as a service provider? Do you get the opportunity to down tools and wait? Do you have to go and source them yourself? Do you have to try and mitigate the responsibility in relation to getting those things sorted? Can you charge for your downtime while you're sitting there waiting for everything to be rectified? Do you suspend the service at that point? And at that point, do you also then have an ability to reallocate the staff? And what happens at the end of that if you have reallocated the staff while you're waiting and those staff aren't available at the point where you start to reinitiate on the services? So a lot of those things need to be kind of worked their way through as to what happens at the end of it. A lot of this can be dealt with in the standard terms of the contract, and there is an inclination to try and avoid putting prescribed service levels into an agreement. Certainly there is an inclination from a service provider's perspective. I don't want to get too prescriptive around what it is that I have to deliver. But in a lot of cases, I've suggested that's probably not the best outcome. I think the best thing to do is to kind of front up about being clear what it is that you're going to deliver, because in that clarity, not only do you create potentially some risk for yourself, but you also look to manage the risk that you might have of unreasonable expectations, or at least explore those expectations in advance so that there is truly a meeting of the minds. You will find often in services agreements that the contract or the customer will say something like, you will provide services to the following levels. Now, sometimes you just can't control whether you will be able to meet those levels or not, and you may be inclined to look for some softening of a positive commitment that you will achieve these outcomes to, you'll endeavour to achieve these outcomes, or you'll use best endeavours to achieve these outcomes, or you'll use reasonable endeavours to achieve these outcomes. I'm okay with, those kind of commitments as long as it's clear what it is that you are looking to try and achieve off the other end of it. Because the reality is that with some things, you cannot guarantee that there will be 100% uptime or 99.5% uptime. The best that you can be certain of is that you're going to do the very best you can to deliver that service. The way to manage that, though, is to talk about your service levels. And in your service levels, you then start to get more prescriptive around what it is that you're trying to achieve and what happens if you don't achieve those things. And so you could, in the front end of your contract, you could have a commitment that I will use, reasonable endeavours to achieve the outcomes or to achieve the service levels. That then, of course, doesn't give the customer an ability to actually terminate or claim breach unless you fail to use your reasonable endeavours to get to that outcome. What then needs to happen is in your service level agreement, you have to then start to look at what happens if a level isn't met. So it may be that you are then starting to look at service levels from a much more finite or a much more defined level, and let's kind of work with a SaaS solution and the commitment that the solution is going to operate in accordance with the documentation, and it will be available X period of X percentage of the required time. You're expecting that it will be up 99.9% of the time. If it's below 99%, then what happens? If it's below 99.5%, what happens? If it's below 98%, what happens? You get the ability at that point to start to break down the levels at which certain consequences happen, and it becomes easier for you to make sure that you're kind of meeting the expectations of the customer. The flip side from the customer's perspective is that part of the conversation that the service provider should be having with the customer is, look, risk will always be priced. If you're expecting me to guarantee 99.9%, that's going to require, well, I'm not sure whether I'm comfortable actually ever being able to commit to that, but to be able to commit to that, I'm going to have to build, the perfect mousetrap, and that's going to cost, or I'm going to have twice as many resources, twice as many people available to make sure that I can achieve the outcomes that you're looking for. Do you really need that level of commitment? Because that's going to result in this kind of cost. So it becomes this question of do you need that Rolls-Royce service, or can you live with something slightly less? What is the expectation that you have? And that's when you start to pull apart your services and your service levels and understand where it is that you can get to in relation to it. I've got a note here saying what happens outside of service levels. I guess what I'm referring to here is sometimes when you're looking at service levels, you can end up with a situation where it says 95% of requests will be responded to within 2 hours, and will be remedied within 10 hours or something like that. What then becomes a question is, well, what happens to the 5%? Do they not have to be responded to at all? If you're a customer, obviously that 5% becomes a little bit problematic. If you're a service provider, that's probably not problematic, other than the fact that you might have a really grumpy customer in circumstances where those 5% you just don't feel like you have to kind of respond to at all. So one of the things that I always like to do is always run with the counterfactual in relation to these things. If my service levels say 95% will be responded to in this period of time, what does that mean in relation to the 100%? The other thing that you need to look at is, in terms of this, is understanding how these things are measured. If you're talking about things like uptimes and availability and response times, over what period are these going to be measured? Because obviously, 95% of a day is a lot less downtime than 95% of a week and 95% of a month and 95% of a year. The bigger the measurement period, the greater the downtime. And it doesn't mean that, anything other than the fact that one downtime could be, if you're measuring it over an entire year, it could be a very long period of time if it all happens at once. And so you then need to start to look at how do you measure these things in other ways. It may be that you're very comfortable running this on a quarterly basis, saying, I'm okay. If you're a customer, you're saying, I'm okay if there is 95% uptime over a quarter, provided that no one incident happens for longer than X period of time. And again, that comes back to a conversation that needs to be had at that time to make sure that everybody understands what you're buying, what you're delivering, and whether you're delivering kind of the Rolls Royce or the next level down of service, because it will all be priced. Double counting as an issue and overlapping service levels. One of the things that I'm really keen to make sure that service level agreements actually actively and accurately reflect is that you don't end up with a double counting of the service levels themselves. If you have an availability service level and you have a rectification service level, there is a risk that they will overlap. Because if you don't rectify a fault within the right period of time, then it will not be up. And if it's not up, your availability measure is being affected, but so also is your response time one. So you need to make sure that when you start to look at your service levels and how they're measured, do they overlap? And if they do overlap, then you need to start to address that as an issue in terms of talking about, if I'm liable under one, you can't ping me under more than one at a time. And again, I'm not, from a customer perspective, when I'm looking at this sort of thing, I'm not necessarily seeing that as a bad conversation to have, because ultimately the level of risk that's involved in kind of a double jeopardy on some of these things could result in a price that I am paying that I just don't need to pay because I don't need that level of service. I've got a note here that the penalty test has changed. This is one of the problems with being as old as I am in terms of the way that I've been practicing, the period I've been practicing law, is that the law keeps changing on me and I have to try and keep up with it. The old adage that we used to have, and even now, the courts really don't like penalties and they won't really enforce a penalty. What they'll do is they'll want to make sure that whatever it is the consequence is reasonable. The old test in relation to this used to be that liquidated damages couldn't be recovered unless there were a reasonable pre-estimate of the loss that was going to be suffered. In recent times, we've had a couple of cases which have kind of explored this, and the law is starting to move in a different direction. It's not necessarily saying anymore it's got to be a reasonable pre-estimate of the loss. What it's looking at is whether the consequence of a failure is proportionate to the legitimate interest of the parties, and that's looked at the time that you enter into the contract. There's a bunch of things that are now taken into account as part of that, including things like the bargaining positions of the parties, and the courts then analyse that on the basis of are the rights in relation to what happens as a result of the breach, are they disproportionate to the interests that they're seeking to protect? In one of the cases, it was Honeybee's case, was a childcare centre, and they were looking at, there was a commitment in the contract around putting in a second lift, and if it didn't happen in a certain period of time, then there were some very clear and not insignificant consequences, and that's what resulted in the courts looking at it, looking at the test for penalties and trying to decide whether this was a legitimate, whether it was a kind of legitimate interest and proportionate to the interests of the parties that were negotiated. They don't see necessarily that having something in there that is a bit of a stick to encourage compliance being a bad thing, but it just can't be disproportionate to the interest that you're trying to protect. So yeah, so the old pre-estimate of the loss is kind of has gone. Now they're looking at, effectively, is what you're asking for, is the consequence of the breach and what would happen under the contract, is it reasonable, is it appropriate, is it proportionate, does it reflect the interests of the parties? The other thing I guess that we should be talking about at this time is unfair contract terms. Now, unfair contract terms, and the reason this kind of comes up here, but it actually applies much broader across service contracts generally, is that the Fair Trading Act has had in it for a period of time, in terms of standard form contracts, protection of consumers in relation to terms that are unfair. Things like, the ability to unilaterally change the terms of the contract and things like that. A bill has made its way through Parliament, which extends that, so it now also applies to small or low value trading contracts of a standard form. So if at the moment it is set at the trading relationship is one that has less than $250,000, including GST payable per year at the start of that contract. And that can be, it doesn't need to be under that contract, it can be under that relationship. So it may be that the relationship is spread across a number of contracts. What they're going to do is look at the relationship as a whole as part of that to ascertain. And the process that they, I guess, from a supplier point of view in relation to this, or even from a customer point of view in relation to this, as a customer, one of the things that a contracting party under the contract should be aware of is that there is always a risk that you could find that one of your terms is at some point considered unfair, and therefore you may find it not able to be enforced. This isn't something that could just happen on a one-off basis. This is generally applied across very standard form contracts that are generally and widely kind of accepted. So I guess what I'm saying is just keep an eye and keep in mind terms that you consider maybe pushing the boundaries of what might be considered reasonable, because there's always a risk at some point that somebody would challenge it. Or seek it to be challenged. So then the next thing that we should look at as part of a conversation about services and service levels is service credits. And this kind of, you take this in the context of making sure that that what you're asking for isn't unfair, make sure that it's not seen as a penalty. Many times I've kind of looked at a contract and thought that the service credits really aren't a reflection of actually the loss that's going to be suffered. They are really, as much as anything, a basis for making sure that that the service provider is focused on continuing to deliver the best service that they can, and if they don't, that a discount is given to reflect that you had, ordered and were paying for a Rolls Royce, and it turned out that you'd actually only got a Ford Cortina. So it's really about just making sure that you've got a reasonable set of terms in there, and you set your service credit accordingly. I think some of the other things that you should consider in relation to this are, how do you look at perhaps using other things, because the reality is that often service credits aren't going to be the thing that's going to get the customer what they're looking for, which is actually the quality of the service and the service delivered to the levels that they had originally sought. So what you're looking for is other ways and other levers that you might be able to kind of use, because often the service credits themselves aren't going to kind of wholly compensate them for the service that they haven't received. So one of the things that that can be quite useful is an escalation process, which is looking at the manner in which you can kind of get greater focus of more senior people and greater attention and more reporting at a time when you really need it. And so that can be a process of just making sure that you escalate the longer that the problem exists and the longer that it runs for. It's also then differentiating between levels of priority or levels of criticality of the problem that exists. And then the final thing to talk about is, within looking at your service levels, you can look at service credits. So there's some money that's going to be a discount, a penalty, or not a penalty, but an amount that's payable every time something happens, or the longer something happens. You can escalate, so you can have the relationship manager kind of reporting at the beginning, and then the office manager reporting, and then the CEO reporting over a period of time, depending on how long and how critical the failure is. And then the final one, and this is the one that that is useful to kind of look at as part of kind of a conversation about, I can't make a positive commitment to you that I will deliver this service. I will use my reasonable endeavors to deliver this service. But if the service is so bad that it's not working for you, this is the point at which we can terminate the contract. You can terminate the contract if it's got so bad that you're not actually delivering everything that you would expect, so that the business can run in the manner that you're expecting it to run. So it's looking at these kind of different ways of escalating and making sure that the service levels and the service credits and the escalation process all link properly into the service commitment that you're making. I've got a couple of examples here that we can kind of look at just in terms of approaches on these things. The first one is a relatively simple conversation around availability. And availability, it's really important to understand what is available. And available has to kind of look at not only the period over which it's measured, what downtime is excluded, but also what is considered available. And as part of this, you need to start to think about, are we kind of committing that this will work to the level set out in the proposal, this will work to the level set out in the documentation, and what are the exceptions to that? Why would this thing not work like that? Are there things that the customer can do that might impact on it? And is it clear, and particularly if you're a customer, is it clear from your perspective what is considered things that are excluded from the measurement of availability? Coming into the second part of this, looking at it from a perspective of response times and escalation times and that sort of thing, what you have to do is you have to look at your service levels, look at your services, and make sure you understand what is critical, what is high, what's medium, what's low, and also make sure that they are not at a level where they potentially overlap, because if they potentially overlap, then you have a problem with the two parties starting to argue about whether this is a high or a medium or a critical. You also need to have an understanding as to who gets the final call in relation to this. Is it the customer or is it the service provider? Does the customer get to make the call, but after everything is resolved, does the do you get to go back and look at it and work out whether it really was critical or high, whether it really was something that was created by a failure of the service, failure of what was provided by the service provider, or is this something that that you are able to be on the clock for because it's not something that actually you created or were responsible for? A process like this, if I'm acting for a customer, I'm not necessarily too concerned about kind of going back and looking at it later, because the reality is, if you're calling something critical, you believe it's critical, or you're kind of behaving in a kind of a bad fashion. If you're calling it critical, then it's something that is impacting on your business, and you just at that point, it's actually more about getting the thing solved than it is about being cute about moving something from high to critical just because it's going to be beneficial to you. If you get called on that later, then you should kind of front up to it. But at the moment, what you really want to do is just know that your service is actually going to work and you're going to get the support that you need. So you can see in this breakdown on the table here, you've got your critical, your high, your medium, your low, you've got your response times, whatever they might be, your resolution time, and points and escalation. Now, if you look at the next slide, we're starting here to look at things like service points. And basically what we're talking about here is, look, if it's not responded to or restored within that period of time that you had committed to, then this will accumulate this number of points. The second part of this is, and this is sometimes something that is missing from service level agreements, is what happens after that. So if you go back to the previous slide and you say escalation or resolution time is 2 hours, and it's not resolved within 2 hours, what happens? At the end of 2 hours, does that mean basically there's no further consequence in relation to this? That's one of the things that you need to kind of make sure that you think about, particularly as a customer. It's something that you would want to think about, what happens at that point after 2 hours. What we're dealing with here is a further accrual. So what we're saying is a further of the same number of points will continue to accrue every time another 2 hours lapses, or another 10 hours lapses, or another 24 hours lapses. And then the escalation side of it, the person reporting on the fault will escalate if the fault is not restored within that same period of time. And it's going to continue to escalate, and they're going to continue to report on each time this happens. So if the escalation is 2 hours, you might move up through the ranks over those 2 hours. It might be for the first 24 hours, you have got the relationship manager talking to you every 2 hours, what's going on, because this is critical. After that, it might escalate up to somebody more senior. By the time you've got the CEO on the phone, it's and they're reporting every 2 hours. I think sometimes that is actually more motivating than the dollars that are being paid or at risk. Here's a second example, again looking at kind of criticals and priority ones, priority twos. This one here, you can see that we're getting a little bit clearer about it not being a priority one. So we kind of have built this one from the top down. We've started with something that's immediate, that needs to happen. And the reason that this one, we have to kind of say it's not a P1 when you get to a high, is because there is a little risk that something could be seen as a P1 or a P2 here. So what we've made it clear is that this is for a P2. It can't be something that falls into the P1 category as well as into the P2 category. Again, this is one where we started to break down the resolution time. So we've got targets around resolution times, 90% within 90 minutes and 100% within 120 minutes. Often you'll see the 90% within 90 minutes and then the rest is just left hanging. And so what you're looking for here is some clarity around, what happens if we don't hit, well, on the 10% that aren't done within 90 minutes. The update frequency every 45 minutes until resolution on a P1. That sounds pretty steep, but I'm not sure whether I just decided to get a little aggressive here on my example. And we've got incident reports within 24 to 48 hours of resolution. And I guess the reason that you're looking at an incident report in relation to it is because this is a critical level, and what you're wanting to understand is how unstable is the system, how unstable is the service that I've been receiving, and can I expect this to happen again? How do we remedy it so that we don't have this level of failure happen again? So I guess that is a very quick kind of run through the slides. I'm happy to take questions, get a conversation going in relation to service levels and what people are seeing on service levels. Does anybody have something they want to talk to? Anybody have something they want to share?
Yep, I have a question.
Sure.
One of the very common service level issues that arises in the health sector at the moment is that of security and customers wanting an absolute guarantee that what you provide is 100% secure, for which my argument has always been that the only 100% secure application is one that no one can access. There is no such thing as 100% secure. Are you dealing with security as a service level requirement in terms of how secure is this and what guarantees can we offer around hacking and denial of service and things like that?
That's a really good question, Ken. I've been on both sides of that conversation, and again, that comes back to what happens in the silence. What happens? Often a service provider will say, "Look, I'll do everything I can to keep you secure," and the customer will say, "Is that good enough? Because if you do everything you can, but I still end up with, as a result of your behavior, being
a breach of privacy,
I still have a problem." And so it becomes an allocation of risk between the parties as to, am I going to be responsible? Am I going to be responsible for you not being hacked? Am I going to be responsible for you being hacked as a result of my conduct? Or am I going to be responsible for me failing to try to stop you being hacked? And it becomes a question in each case as to what it is that you're selling. If you are selling a secure, a security service, then I think it's kind of hard to say, well, actually, I'm not responsible. It then becomes a question of how do you handle the failure to meet the service level that you've committed to. If, on the other hand, what you're selling is a solution, and that solution has as part of it, it being an online service or a cloud-based service, then the commitments that you can make are often, it becomes a question of, it's no longer you will not be hacked. It becomes a question of you won't be hacked as a result of me versus I'll try and make sure you won't be hacked. And then that's where the kind of the debate ends up is who carries that risk. And often it comes down to a conversation of risk and cost. I can't guarantee that you're going to be able to that I won't be hacked. What I will say is I'm meeting all industry standards. I'm doing all industry standard protections, and that should be good enough. And then you're still going to have a conversation about, yes, I know, but if you do all of those things and they're not good enough, who carries the risk? Because ultimately, me, the customer, I'm sitting there and I've still suffered loss. I'm not looking to recover loss that I haven't suffered. I've still suffered loss. That loss has arisen as a result of your act or omission. Whether it's one that could be said to be negligent or not doesn't matter. I've still ended up with my data being breached as a result of your conduct. That's the debate that the customer is going to have. And you can say, in response to that, yes, but nobody can guarantee 100%. And it's going to be a cost risk allocation. If you ask me to assume that level of risk, then I'm going to need to talk to my insurers about the level of risk that I'm prepared to be able to take, and I'm going to have to price that in to the nature of the service that I'm providing to you. But it's a debate that is being had a lot at the moment. Does that help?
Yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah, it is complicated, and there is no one answer, Ken. It becomes a debate as to how much control do you think that you've got over it? How big is the risk that you think there is as a service provider in there being something insecure? And and then an allocation of the risk between you and the customer. And it's perfectly acceptable for a service provider to say, I don't want to carry that level of risk. It comes back to, and this is one of the things that we will talk about a bit more when we get to the liability one. It becomes a question of, do you want to carry the level of risk that you are asking? Do you want to pay the price for the level of risk that you're asking me to carry the risk for? If you go to a dry cleaner and you said to them, I want you to carry the risk that my suit won't be damaged, and if it turns out it is damaged, you owe me the entire price of that suit, the cost of dry cleaning will go through the roof. You'll see that they often basically limit it to a certain amount of money, because that's how they can manage the risk and still keep the cost down. And so it becomes an interplay between the service level that you're prepared to sign up to, the consequences as a result of that, the steps that you will take in terms of, if it does happen, how do you resolve that, and then the liability that you have. One of the things that I think helps in all of this is kind of having that conversation about, if I'll use reasonable endeavours to, or I'll apply industry standard protections. That's my commitment, and if I fail to do that, then I'm in breach. But otherwise, if a breach occurs, my steps will be, I'll do this and this and this to help you resolve it. I'll and get specific about what you'll do in terms of working with them to identify the breach, working with them to identify the affected parties, working with them to do those sorts of things within a liability cap. And that may in itself help you manage that conversation with them. And again, it comes back to what I said at the beginning. It's about having a conversation with your customer and making sure that they understand that this is a two-way street. You're in business to to provide services to them, but you can't carry all of the risk in relation to the business that they are transacting.
It's also further complicated by the fact that there are often multiple layers. We deliver applications on top of infrastructure that's being provided by hosting organizations and data centers where we have agreements with them. So it comes down to that, who is responsible.
Yeah, and it is getting more and more complex, because when you look at a standard cloud solution or SaaS solution, it's sitting on an Azure stack or an AWS, and I can guarantee that they're not going to stand up for parts of it. And so, how much of that do you carry the risk of? Mm-hmm. I'd be recommending, if I was your advisor, I'd be kind of trying to carve that element out. And what I'm seeing, though, is that customers are starting to get to understand that there are some elements that you just can't control, because they also try and get anything better out of AWS. They're not going to get it, are they? So you can, as part of your conversations, work on the basis of, this is what I can control. This is what I'm prepared to step up to for what I can control. If it happens at another level, then I've got no ability to control that. What I'll do is I'll pass through the rights that I can to you in relation to the people that I'm working with.
Great, thank you.
I think there was a question, Marie, that came in.
Yeah, by whom or how is good industry practice determined?
Awesome. It's determined. I guess it's determined once you start to litigate it, and it would be determined. The judge would be challenged with a process of looking at it and going, what is industry standard practice? And then they would call on experts to provide them with evidence that this is industry standard expert, and so industry practice. And so you would end up in a position where you'd have dueling experts as to, no, this is industry standard, no, this is industry standard, and the judge would have to make the final call. Part of the value of an industry standard is that in a lot of cases, there may be a very obvious industry standard, ISO standards and that sort of thing that people can point to. If they're not things that are naturally ISO, measured or kind of there's clear standards in relation to, then you're going to end up down the dueling experts path. But to the extent that you actually have a standard in mind, talk to that standard. Talk about, that as part of your commitment on the service levels. This is the services that I'm providing, and these will be provided in accordance with standard X. So that hopefully helps in terms of that debate, but ultimately any kind of comment about it without an undefined industry standard, there is always a risk, and that risk therefore drives a certain behavior out of the service provider, because the service provider then is unsure what is an industry standard, and they will try and meet what they consider to be the best one to make sure that doesn't come back to haunt them later. Does that, I'm not sure who asked that question, but hopefully that answers it.
It was Trevor Delaney.
Thanks, Trevor. That was a good question. Do we have any more questions? I'm really happy to kind of chat about anything. Craig, you promised me that you had a question for me.
I've been trying to think of a really tricky one, but I can't find one at the moment.
Okay.
I was going to ask something about, should you be negotiating at 2 o'clock in the morning service levels? Because it never goes well, does it?
No. Well, that's the shared experience, though, Craig.
Mm-hmm.
2 o'clock in the morning.
Can you just? Yeah, that's right. I was just interested because some of the negotiations we've been involved in, have been unequal on the parties. And you made some comment before about AWS. I mean, what sort of approach should you take when dealing with a provider like that is highly unlikely to move on any of their service levels or contractual arrangements?
I think, and I really don't want to do lawyers out of work here, but the reality is that in a lot of cases, those sorts of contracts are not going to be hugely negotiated. What you need to do is you need to go through those sorts of contracts and understand the nature of the risk that you're dealing with, and that is the nature of SaaS and cloud these days. Is you have to kind of accept a level and a profile of risk, because you're dealing with an organization that has thousands and hundreds of thousands of customers, and they cannot afford to have deviated liability and risk depending on every customer and client, because they're providing one homogenous service to everybody. So then it becomes a question of, do I kind of move myself up the curve so I become somebody important enough that actually I get a degree of negotiation, or do I accept what it is and accept that is just part and parcel of the cost of the delivery of the service that I'm getting? And then you have to kind of pass that through as best you can. If that's an integral part of the service and the solution that you're providing to your customers, then I would be, if I can, as transparent as I can about what goes into my solution, and to the extent that I can, I'd be looking to back out the things that I can't control. If you're transparent about it, most customers will understand, I can't deliver anything greater than Amazon will deliver to me. I can't deliver a solution if the internet is down. I can't deliver a service if my telco is not providing a service to me. I will enforce that as best I can, but to the extent I don't have control over it, there are forces greater than me that are at work.
Good answer. I'd pay for that answer.
I think you might have.
Yeah.
Simon, it's Rill here. I had a question for you around dealing with levels of risk when you're dealing with trying to integrate with legacy systems, so sort of that digital debt, and perhaps you're a bit more of an innovative solution and you're trying to integrate somewhere else. How do you manage that risk, and how do you put that into the contract?
That's a really good question, Rill. It's a really good question. The challenge you've got, and this comes back to the kind of the analysis that you do at the beginning in terms of who carries what risk and what happens in the silence. And again, it's one of those things that I'd encourage everybody that's kind of here to make sure that when you look at your services, make sure that you and your service levels, you understand what are the assumptions that are happening and where is the silence on these things. Because if you're not careful, the silence will end up falling on your side and you'll be responsible for it. One of the things you have to do at the beginning is make sure you understand as a service provider or as a customer, whichever way you go on it, what are your responsibilities and who carries the balance of the risk on this thing. And that comes down to, I need a service and I'm going to do the following things, and you'll deliver everything else so I can receive that service. That carries the risk. The service provider carries the risk at that point because the customer has specifically identified what it is that they will do. On the other hand, if you go the other way, the service provider can kind of work on the basis of, you need this service. I'm going to do the following things in relation to that service. Everything else to enable that service to be successfully delivered is up to you. And that's where the baton passes the other way. So in terms of a legacy system, one of the things you're going to need to be able to kind of work on, particularly as a service provider on those, is to make sure that the way in which the solution that you are delivering operates with the current system of the customer is the customer's responsibility. The difficulty that you're going to have in that is, what is reasonable to pass over to the customer and what's not. Now, if you are if you're a solution that sits on top of, on top of SAP, then actually it's probably fair for the customer to expect that you will stay in step with SAP. However, if that solution that you're delivering, which is an SAP solution, needs to interface with a non-standard, employment solution, then you would, as the service provider, want to make sure that I'll deliver this part of the solution, but if the non-standard employment software or environment has to interface and that changes, that's your risk, that's your cost. I'm happy to help you, but I'll have to go back on the clock for that. So it becomes very important to be clear about where the responsibility lies, and that, that's not law really. That's just about working with your customer, working with your service provider to be clear about what it is that you're expecting to be delivered. Do we have any more questions?
I'm still on mute. Thanks for that, Simon.
It's okay.
Any more questions, anyone, before we wrap this up?
Kate, surely you've got a question for me.
I haven't really.
Really?
No.
It's not like you.
I enjoyed the session though, and I'm listening very much. I think this is the, these are the gotchas, aren't they?
Yeah.
I guess the point that I would probably take from everything you've said is just, it's much easier to negotiate this up front than it is to kind of rectify it downstream when everything has gone wrong or the questions are being asked. So the fact that you've got it up front, you have the conversation, and your point about the relationship, I think, is so true, because, you hope you'll never be in a position where you have to pull out your contract. But having had these discussions up front when the relationship is strong and you're just entering into the partnership, just makes so much sense to me. So yeah, I really thought that was very valid.
Look, one of the things that I would, and I really don't want to do lawyers out of a job, but one of the things that I would say in relation to this is that there should not be any magic in the contract that you're negotiating in terms of reading that contract. The reality is that you will understand the relationship that you want to have with your customer, or the relationship you want to have with your service provider, better than anybody else will. What you need to do is have that conversation at the beginning to make sure that the contract tells the story of how you're going to engage with that customer, how you're going to deliver the service to that customer on a regular basis, and how, if everything turns pear-shaped, how you're going to extract yourself from that relationship with the customer. Have that whole conversation up front, because the better way to do it is to do it up front, because it is not a cheap process to go through and litigate this at the other end of it. It's a lot easier for you to kind of document that at the beginning. And that's not me kind of touting for work, because you don't need necessarily a lawyer to have those conversations to start with, to make sure that you understand clearly what it is that you're going to do, who's going to carry the risk for the legacy system, who's going to carry the risk for data breach and hacking and those sorts of things. Understand what it is, but also understand what it is that you're selling. Understand what it is that you are kind of putting out there for customers to buy, and what a reasonable expectation it is for that customer to buy from you. Make sure that you're not kind of pushing. Make sure that you're not pushing too much onto the customer, and make sure that you're not allowing the customer to put things on you that you can't control. There will, at the end of it, be a number of things that neither of you can control, and then it becomes a question of who carries the risk in relation to those things. And that's what I refer to as the silence. That's the things that neither of you actually have a degree of control over, and you should be clear about who carries that risk, because that will change the nature of the perception that you have about the cost of this contract to you.
That's great. Thank you, Simon. You know, when I was listening to you, it took me back to my IBM and EDS days, where I used to actually write service level agreements with all of our people and all our vendors and things. And yeah, it's been a wee while since I've put one together, actually, but all of those things that you talked about, it took me right back 20 years. But thank you so much. I thought it was great. I hope everyone else enjoyed it as well. And I'm really looking forward to the next session actually next week. So thank you, everybody, for coming and joining us, and I hope you found that helpful. Any last words from you, Simon?
Look, hopefully this has been of use. I'm really keen to have these things each week, and I'm very happy to have a conversation, because all of you are negotiating these things on a regular basis. And the questions that were asked today were really good, insightful questions. There are no easy answers to these things, and all of you have experience that we can kind of share and learn from in terms of the way to approach these things. So yeah, look, I'm very keen to have people come to the next session, and we can talk about things like intellectual property ownership and the challenges and the interplay between the intellectual property and the confidentiality and privacy and data, and some really interesting and juicy topics to talk through yet. So look, hopefully some of you can make the next session, and hopefully you've got some really good questions and insights that we can share.
Yeah, that'd be great. And I just want to add that if you think of something a bit later,